Wonderful. Well, good day, everyone. My name is Marion Volkmann-Brandau, and I'm the Deputy Co-Lead on the Murad Code project. And on behalf of the Institute for International Criminal Investigations, or IICI, my colleagues and I are pleased to welcome you to this webinar. IICI is spearheading the Murad Code project, which is being supported by the Government of Canada through Global Affairs Canada until 2026. Want to do, starting this webinar, is to ask you a first question. We want to run a quick poll to see how many of you are familiar with the Murad Code. We have 86% of participation. That's not bad. Do you want to share the results?
The results are that more people were unfamiliar with the code before joining this webinar. So 25 out of the 40 people who answered and 15 out of 40 were familiar with it already.
But I feel that it's even if the majority of you are not familiar with the code, the fact that we have more than 50 participants joining in on this webinar today shows that today's topic is of interest to you. And that's why we're very encouraged to see that we have participants from all over the region, including from Burkina Faso, Chad, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and also other countries that are not in Africa. And that shows how important the topic is. And so let me, for those who are not familiar with the code, let me explain what the Murad Code is. Its full name is the Global Code of Conduct for Gathering and Using Information about Systematic and Conflict-Related Sexual Violence. And it's a global consultative initiative aimed at building a community of better practice for, with, and concerning survivors of systematic and conflict-related violence, SRSV, as we call it in short. The code was named after Nadia Murad, a leading advocate for survivors of SCRSV and a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. And the key objective of this project is to respect and support survivors' human rights. And the need for such a code came from the realization that ineffective, unsafe, unethical practice of investigation, documentation, recording, gathering, and using information about systematic and conflict-related sexual violence, however well-intended, cause or amplify harm suffered by survivors. And in the end, it also diminished their chances for accessing justice. In fact, when it comes to justice and truth-seeking, unfortunately, until today, more often than not, everywhere in the world, the experiences of women and girls is often unacknowledged and overlooked. And this is why today we want to spotlight 4 countries in West Africa that have grappled with civil war, authoritarian regimes, or ongoing internal conflict, but have become really relatively stable democracies despite these challenges. 3 of them, the Gambia, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, have experienced different forms of transitional justice. And we can learn valuable lessons from the way survivors were treated during these processes. Nigeria, with its ongoing internal conflict and the Boko Haram insurgency, is also extremely relevant to this discussion around how survivors of conflict-related violence are approached and treated, including by the media. So we will explore these lessons with our 4 distinguished speakers in 2 rounds of questions. We will be presenting past gaps, but also transformative approaches, and we will be hearing from them how future mechanisms, for example, the hybrid court and the war crime chamber that should be set up in the Gambia and Liberia respectively, can offer a pathway of greater accountability and dignity for victims, their families, and communities. So let me now kick off the discussion by introducing you to the first panelist. Fatou Balde is someone who challenges stereotypes. Indeed, she's an African human rights defender who began her activism in no other place than Scotland, where she was addressing abuses faced by migrant women. And it is for her work that she was honored by the late Queen Elizabeth II with an MBE. Following the fall of the Jammeh regime in 2017, she returned to the Gambia and founded the organization Women in Liberation and Leadership, short WILL, to transform and protect women's lives and rights. Her multifaceted works includes publishing a shadow report highlighting the gendered impacts of authoritarian rule and the intersectionality of women experiences. Many of them were missed by the Gambian Truth Commission. This year alone, Fatou received 2 prestigious awards, the U.S. State Department's International Women of Courage Award, as well as the International Human Rights Award from the Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy. She received them as a testament to her work, including for a crucial advocacy to end female genital mutilation, which is needed more than ever, as the Gambian Parliament is examining a law to repeal the prohibition of this practice. With that introduction, welcome, Fatou. It is a pleasure to have you with us today. Fatou, the first question to you is the following. While recognized and applauded for its efficiency and impact in the Gambian society, the main criticism against the Truth, Reconciliation and Reparations Commission, the TRC as it is known, was that it lacked gender sensitivity and a sufficient focus on the gendered impacts of the Jammeh regime. And today we'd like to hear from you, in your opinion, why did that happen? Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Marian, and thank you for having me. So the Gambia Truth, Reconciliation and Reparations Commission, which is also, we call it the TRRC, when it was set up, our staff and the secretariat and the commissioners were sent on a study tour to South Africa and Sierra Leone. And one of the key lessons they learned was how both of these countries didn't adequately document the experiences of women. So our TRRC wanted to do better and to be more gender sensitive. Therefore, one of the things that was first done was to make sure that as part of our commissioners, we had female representatives. So we had 4 female commissioners. We also had a gender unit, which was referred to as the Women's Affairs Unit. We also had a psychosocial support unit for victims. And these were all put together to support women's participation in the process. And I have to admit that at the first, even the CSO's representatives, myself included, were very encouraged by this. Unfortunately, this became the yardstick for gender-sensitive response to our TRRC. It was soon clear for us that both Sierra Leone and South Africa were very different contexts, both in terms of the violations that they had experienced, but also the socio-cultural context of the Gambia and these 2 countries were very different. So, for example, the Gambia is a very highly patriarchal society, and as such, gender roles, responsibilities, and expectations are very much prescribed for men and women. Our TRRC operation was very much of a reflection of the Gambian society, where even though we had women, for example, the women commissioners, but men occupy most of the decision-making positions. They also dominated the narrative as well as the working environment. And because of that, they lacked a gender lens in the whole operations and the way it was conducted. I actually remember at the beginning of the TRRC, when we were looking at what kind of violations would the TRRC look at. When the question of SGBV came up, many wondered how would it be proven and whether women would actually be trusted to be telling the truth. I, however, noticed that the same question wasn't asked when it came to other forms of violations that were being looked at. So whilst the TRRC afterwards really made efforts to include SGBV victims and encourage them to come forward and share their experiences, the fear of societal reprisal, shame, and stigma prevented many women from taking part in the process. We also saw this prejudice even when few of the women came forward and used the TRRC process. Many of them didn't receive a backlash. Also, with the way that the TRRC was going, where it was set up, when women came in to access the gender unit, they had to go through men in uniform, where they had to give in their information. And for most of the victims, it was triggering for them to have access to these places. So there were a lot of gaps in providing meaningful support for women to participate. However, on a positive side, we saw how the TRRC broke the culture of silence and the taboo around sexual and gender-based violence in the Gambia. Even though we are still struggling with victim blaming and backlash, it definitely did break that culture of silence and really open up a conversation on SGBV in the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fatou, for sharing your analysis about the gaps, but also the impact of the TRC's work when it comes to speaking out about SGBB under dictatorship. At the outset of this discussion, you have highlighted several very crucial drivers of bad practices towards survivors. These included the mistakes made during the initial setup of the institution and the gender imbalance in decision-making position. I noted that you said Gambia is a highly patriarchal society, but I'm yet to see one on earth that is not. The lack of understanding of the gendered impact of human rights violation, including among female staff. Importantly, you also highlighted, which I think is really interesting, the inadequacy of the location and of some of the procedures that can be intimidating and even triggering. I note that you have also recognized that the TRC broke the silence around rape, and that you, while still, even though survivors received backlash, it still opened up the debate in the Gambia as never before. Now, let's turn to the second panelist, Councillor Isaac George. Councillor George is a prosecuting lawyer and director of Sexual Crimes Unit at the Ministry of Justice in Liberia. He has extensive experience in the prosecution of sexual-related offense. With a track record of securing conviction against numerous perpetrators, he is a steadfast advocate for justice and empowerment. Beyond the courtroom, Councillor George actively engages in community outreach, school programs, and media campaigns. He champions education and an awareness as pivotal tools in the prevention and reduction of sexual and gender-based violence, striving to create a safer environment for all. Welcome, Councillor. It is also a great privilege to have you with us today. And we would like you to tell us what, in your experience, are the greatest barriers facing survivors coming forward to seek justice. The floor is yours.
So I would like to say thank you for the opportunity and the platform. And basically, I will be very much succinct to the question posted. So the greatest barrier hello?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Am I connected?
Maybe. Yes, you are. Can you start again, please? Because
Thank you. So as I said earlier, Liberia is a post-war country. And during the Civil War, there were a lot of crimes committed. And basically, there were a lot of victims who were victimized sexually. And unfortunately, these victims are still around. But the fact is that we still have these perpetrators who are still around. And based on the fact that they are around, these victims fear that there would be reprisal when they come forward. And so based on that, they've remained silent. And given the fact that the society seems to be a society of impunity based on what has happened in the past, and there hasn't been a forum for justice. And so many victims fear that we may have similar civil war in the future, or we may have similar calamities, and these perpetrators may form part of this group again. And therefore, they may not be able to get, there may be reprisals, there may be revenge because they came forward. So that has been a very serious factor, fear. And more precise, we also know that ignorance has been a factor. We all understand that given the fact that, as I said earlier, Liberia is a post-conflict area, and during the Civil War, there were a lot of things lost in terms of education. I mean, most of the victims today were born 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and so most of them did not have the opportunity to go to school. And given the fact that they are ignorant of certain things, they do not know that they've been perpetrated against. Some of them are victims out of ignorance, and based on the fact that they do not know that they've been victimized, they fail to come forward. Similarly, stigmatization is a factor, especially for adults. There are many adults who've been abused, but the fear that were they to come forward, they would be stigmatized by society, by their communities. And based on that, they refuse to come forward. A factor, more precise, is protection. Victims feel that if I were to come forward and report a case, how am I going to be protected? Because is the state prepared to protect me thereafter? And most often the answer is no. So based on that, they do not come forward. There is also a lack of confidentiality. Many persons want to come forward, but they want to be, it must be confidential. And unfortunately, over the years, we've been unable in Liberia to actually have a situation where confidentiality remains the hallmark, where victims are not exposed, where information given are kept confidential. There has been also a factor. More precise, the war has immensely created and increased the number of people who are poor. Poverty is a factor. And as we've said earlier, based on the fact that people are poor, and you have individuals who are influential, they have the financial means, they are able to commit crimes and be able to induce the victims, survivors, not to come forward based on the fact compensation in terms of welfare, in terms of academic schooling, and so forth. So basically, these victim survivors will not come forward given the fact that indeed they do not have the means of sustaining themselves, and the perpetrator is able to sustain them. We also have a serious factor of culture, which is embedded with religion and tradition. I mean, basically, there are statutes that establish that a crime an act constitute a crime, but in traditional settings or in religious settings, they may not constitute crimes. So based on that, survivors will not come forward because they believe in the authority they live under. The fear of eviction, the fear of excommunication from the churches or religious groupings or mosques or whatever it is. So basically, there are many factors, but again, we also have a grueling legal process and procedures. And many survivors fear that, well, given the fact that the processes are so long and time-consuming, procrastinating, there is no need to go forward because I may not seek, the justice I seek, I may not have it because it may take 10 years before. What time do I have? So these are factors that are responsible. And we have this jury system in Liberia where jurors are the ones who determine whether a person is convicted or not. And based on the fact that often they empathize more with the perpetrator instead of the victims, believing that they should blames on the victims instead of understanding the plight of the victim. So more precise, there are numerous factors, but these are some of the factors that have actually kept victims or survivors from coming forward to seek justice.
Thank you very much, Councillor. You have highlighted so eloquently some of the greatest barriers, and it was a bit depressing to hear that these are not the only ones, but these are only the greatest for survivors to speak out and to seek support and justice. What I found striking, it was to hear that it basically often trickles down to power imbalances and fear of reprisal, and for stigmatization of the survivor rather than the perpetrator. You also mentioned the lack of education and ignorance, and most importantly, also poverty and vulnerability. You explain how people in power or having some positions in cultural and religious circles also can intimidate victims, feel that they would be outcast from the community. You have also mentioned the biases and shortcomings of the judicial system, which is certainly a global issue. Thank you very much for sharing these insights. So I will now give the floor to our third panelist. Our third panelist is Gloria Cava-Bayo. She's a distinguished Sierra Leonean champion for human rights with over 2 decades of dedication to improving the lives of women and children. Her commitment has been evidenced since the wartime, where she received expert training, enabling her to document the experiences of women and girls in the conflict. Today, Gloria is heading the Gender and Children's Affairs Directorate at the National Human Rights Commission, a vital unit she was instrumental in establishing within this institution. Under her leadership, women and girls who experience sexual violence are oriented towards shelters and supported when seeking justice. A tireless advocate, Gloria has played a key role in shaping transformative legislation for better gender equality and women's empowerment, including most probably, and congratulations to Sierra Leone on that, on last week's historical ban on child marriage. Gloria, we are extremely happy to have you here. As a representative of Sierra Leone, the only country on this panel who has experienced both a Truth Commission and a Special International Crimes Court. But in hindsight, if it had been possible to change anything about the way the TRC and the court worked, what should have been done differently to increase the agency and empowerment of survivors of systematic and conflict-related sexual violence who participated in these 2 processes? The floor is yours.
So if I had the opportunity to recommend, I would have recommended that the TRC and the special courts, we are not supposed to come together because they came in as soon as we are trying to grapple with the effects of and the recommendations of the TRC, then the special court came in. And because the special court came in, there was a lot of attention diverted to the special court, and people started losing focus on the TRC. And the TRC had a lot of victims that testified, but were not properly addressed after especially the women who suffered sexual violence. And we all know in the Sierra Leone War, women suffered brutal violence in the hands of the war factions, both the RAF and the other factions that they were fighting against. So if I had a chance, that is what I would have suggested. Another thing that was lacking was that during those 2 courts, the special court and the TRC, we noticed that there was no proper or extensive sensitization and public education. So the people even misconstrued the work of the special courts. And when the special court came, it focused only on 9 people who they said were the greatest victim. And because it concentrated only on those 9 people, we think it was a waste of resources, because for a whole court to be established just to prosecute 9 people was a waste. When, especially the younger ones that perpetrated, because it was the younger guys that raped, it was the younger guys that caused, chopped off people's hands, pounded babies in mortar, but all those people were just left to go free. And when they went back to the community, it was not easy. Other organizations had to come to do counseling, but it was not easy because most of the people that are psychosocial trauma. And because of that, we have a lot of people who suffer from mental health. Another thing again that was lacking in both institutions was the lack of training for the local staff that were employed, especially when it came to dealing with women who suffered from violence, because they were not properly trained in human rights law and international standard law. They were not able to handle the victims of sexual violence completely. Again, I would have loved to see the special courts bring other people to justice, just as I have said. I would have also loved to see at the end of the day, that special court building that is standing there, because it's now a waste. It was actually a waste. The country has not properly utilized that building. Maybe at the end of the court, they would have maybe transferred the general court there so that it would be still monumental. Thank you.
Gloria, thank you so much for sharing these insights. I'm sure that Fatu and other participants from the Gambia were joining us today. We're listening closely as they're about to embark on a similar pathway, and Liberia as well, indeed. I must say that your comments about, how a court attracts attention as opposed to a Truth Reconciliation Commission is particularly striking, because it's often a little bit the weak point of the system. A lot of resources, and this is not only the case for Sierra Leone, unfortunately, are devoted to the judicial proceedings. But as we know, these are only for selected individuals and are very individual sentencing. So what we're missing, as you said, is so basically, as you said, there's a lot of impunity, and there's less attention to changing the social norms or the understanding, the bias, and as you also mentioned, mental health issues. I also noted that you raised the importance of training of local staff. I would add probably also international staff to have a stronger survivor approach in the judicial proceedings. I think it's well noted that you highlighted public education as well for the larger public to understand what these survivors have gone through. So now, last but not least, I'm delighted to introduce a fourth panelist who comes from a different sector, but one that is extremely important, the media. Ismail Alpha is a Nigerian journalist from Maiduguri, northwestern Nigeria. With 15 years of experience, he's been deeply involved in chronicling the decade-long insurgency that has shaped the region's narrative. His commitment to truth-seeking journalism has taken him to the front lines, where he captures stories that define the essence of this enduring struggle. Alpha's work for international media outlets such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, and Associated Press aims not only to report events, but also to cultivate understanding, empathy, and awareness. Dear Alpha, it's a pleasure to have you here. Please tell us, you have worked with many media outlets, and in 2014, you were involved covering the kidnapping of the Chibok schoolgirls by Boko Haram, which became a huge story that attracted attention in the mainstream global media. On the surface, the level of attention the Chibok girl received seemed like a positive thing for the victims, survivors, and their families. However, in your experience, what were the downsides of how the story was covered? What was the impact of this for the survivors and their families? The floor is yours. Alpha?
Thank you. Initially, when the Chibok girls were abducted, it was very difficult for journalists to understand exactly what happened and to get access, because some politicians were either hiding the story or exploited it for their own political interests. However, a few journalists like myself managed to get on ground and help bring to global attention to this mass abduction, which led to some releases. At the time, however, no attention was paid to stabilizing and caring for the released survivors. Once released, some were held in military facilities or government buildings. Sometimes the military will not even tell the girls or women that they were going to meet journalists. They will simply organize a press conference to show the media that they have released these women and girls. Of course, this raises the question of consent. The girls and women clearly felt that they have to obey those who have rescued them. The environment in which the interview is conducted is also important. Some of these interviews were conducted in the presence of the military and many people around, and journalists were trying to extract information which made the survivors very uncomfortable. Working as a fixer, I also noticed that local and international journalists sometimes lack the necessary awareness of the cultural norms of the people of the North. For example, you cannot ask direct questions like, have you been raped? Some journalists have their questions written out, but they don't take time to get to know the person. I also noticed that some Boko Haram survivors are tired of talking to journalists because they feel that nothing has changed for them economically, and then they remain in a very precarious situation. They ask themselves, why do we come to be interviewed, or why do they come to interview me? Because they want to tell their story, or do they really want to help us? These are questions they ask themselves. Having highlighted all this, I have to say that the majority of international journalists I have worked with are very ethical, and they have also been honest with survivors about their inability to change their lives. These are things that I understood about the whole thing. Thank you.
Well, many thanks, Alpha, for these powerful reflections and for ending on a positive note. I also felt that your intervention was a strong reminder that unfortunately very often incidents of sexual violence become politicized, and this region is surely well placed to know that. And then in such context, it is crucial for journalists to remain impartial. You also highlighted questionable practices when survivors are presented to journalists by men in uniform right after having been released, which poses the question of whether the survivors freely and fully consented to the interview. You also emphasized the need for cultural sensitivity, ethical interviewing practices, and meaningful support for survivors beyond media attention. These aspects as essential part of the Murad Code as well. And therefore, I'm very excited to start now the second round of questions that will focus on positive experiences you have all made and from which we should learn. Fatou, let me start by you. Can you please share an example of a survivor who you know and was undergone a positive transformation? Maybe a story of a survivor who has moved from feeling guilty and ashamed to someone with agency, leadership, and maybe even someone who has become a role model. When answering this question, please let us know what has led to that transformation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you again. I think healing is a journey, and for many victims, especially female victims who had experienced a form of violations during our authoritarian regime, felt that just the ability to speak out and to share what happened to them was a first step for them through the journey. So for many survivors, once upon a time, they didn't believe that there would be an opportunity where they would be able to speak out. So for some people, just speaking out, whether it's through the Truth Commission directly or through the informal processes that were introduced by civil society organizations, they appreciated that they were able to do that. So, but however, it's important for us to acknowledge that also it takes more than just speaking out to really heal. I would like to share a powerful story of empowerment from one of the communities that our civil society organization worked with, called Sinted. It's a community that the former president targeted and accused the community of being witches. And many elders of that community, women and men, were arrested, tortured, forced to drink concoction, and a lot of sexual violence happened during that time. But that was one of the violations. The indirect of those violations were that when these people returned to their communities, they were labeled as witches. And that really created not just the stigma on themselves, but it created a fragmented society, a society that was completely destroyed, because people didn't trust each other anymore. So we introduced our safe spaces there for women. We introduced community dialogues where the communities had the opportunity not only to talk about the violations that happen, but also to use that opportunity to talk about other structural inequalities within that community. We created women support groups where women supported each other, and we introduced economic empowerment projects where the women started a community garden. And we have seen how that community has really transformed, in the sense that one of the women from the victim communities for the very first time contested for local elections because of the empowerment that she received. She didn't win the elections, but for the communities in that region, it was the first time a woman stood up and contested for elections. And she only lost by 4 votes to the man. And for us, it provided a role model for the women and the girls in that community. And she's become a champion for her community. And these days she attends meetings and provide information. Even as the accountability process starts, the Ministry of Justice calls her to represent her community. They give her information and she goes back and trickles it down to her community. So we've seen transformation happen in that, but also transforming victims' lives should also incorporate economic empowerment as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's really moving, I have to say, to hear a positive story and a very untypical also. I think the Jammeh regime was very, very specific in that was this whole witch hunt and the amount of suffering these people went through is clearly very unusual for in other countries. And I won't repeat what you said so eloquently, but I just want to just rethink about what you said. Healing is a journey, and clearly it cannot be achieved through one means only. And you said it, it takes a lot of different angles. It's complex, it's multifaceted, and it's probably not always linear. But through the great work that civil society is doing, including your organization, Will, in the Gambia, offering safe spaces and women support groups, it's really encouraging to see how women and their communities are recovering. So now I will be turning to a justice practitioner that you are, Councillor George, to look at something that is probably more justice related. And I like to hear from you from your opinion as a justice practitioner, what it takes for a survivor to feel that justice has been served. Does the sentencing of the perpetrators suffice? Thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you again. In my past 12 years of persecution and interaction with survivors, I'm of the opinion that the first stage is arrest. When the perpetrator is arrested and placed behind bars pending investigation, that sends a positive sign to the victim survivor. Thereafter, the survivor experiences the issue of psychosocial, the issue of medical, and thereafter, if there is conviction, where the perpetrator is no longer within the community or vicinity of the area, that survivor is very much pleased. But more to that, the survivor believes that there must be reparation or welfare. Often, the perpetrator will always tell the survivor that if you were to inform anyone about what has happened, I may kill you, I may harm you. So once that perpetrator is taken from the community where he no longer has that freedom and the information is propagated out that he is behind bars, and believing that, yes, he is behind bars, possibly see he handcuffed, walk into court, and then go into prison, that gives a serious relief to the survivor. But as I said earlier, there is a need for reparation and welfare of the survivor, because many times the survivor lost almost everything in terms of their emotional being, their mental state, and so they need to recuperate. And in the process of recuperating, their well-being is needed. And once there is a transformation, many times the survivor comes from a very impoverished background. And so that survivor sees herself being placed into school, sometimes change of location, reintegration, relocation, all those things are positive signs for the survivor that she or he has received some level of justice based on the fact that the circumstances have changed thereafter being abused. So many times, conviction is the hallmark, and the absence of the perpetrator from the community, that is satisfactory and excellent for the survivor, because that fear goes away, that this perpetrator may harm me thereafter. It comes to an end. The perpetrator is sentenced to 50 years. He's sentenced to 25 years. The survivor has a breathing space, a freedom that the person I fear most, the person who has harmed me, is now incarcerated. And therefore, he does not have that latitude, that liberty, that freedom to harm or harm other girls. Because many times, the perpetrator is able to harm more girls when he's free, when he's home, when he's within the community. So that comes to an end, absolutely. So that makes a survivor feel that justice has been done and served. So the issue of course, welfare, reparation, medical, psychosocial, they're very important, but the finality that a perpetrator has been placed behind bars, he's sentenced, that is the hallmark. The survivor is satisfied. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you said something quite quickly, but also very important. I think you reminded us that survivors are not only women and girls, but could be also men and boys. And I think that's a very important reminder. Thank you very much for having said so. And I have to say that I was nodding along when you said that this is, having a conviction is so important. And I think we all share that feeling because everywhere in the world, and I've seen recently statistics that are just frightening, in the US and many countries in Europe, less than 2% of rapes lead to conviction. And that's why I assume, I guess, that when there is one, it is really a relief because it's such a rare case. But I thought it was really, really interesting that you also invited us to look past the conviction, because it's not the end for the survivor. The survivors need much more to heal. They also need medical, psychosocial, educational, and economic support, and probably along with broader societal changes to truly feel that justice has been served and to begin the healing process. So thank you again for your intervention. Gloria, Now let me turn to you to ask you some of the key strategies that the National Human Rights Commission in Sierra Leone has adopted to ensure that it's implement a survivor-centered approach to its work. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marion, for coming back to me. As a national human rights institution, which is mandated to promote and protect the rights of everybody in Sierra Leone, they have made it very mandatory to come along with a Directorate of Gender and Children's Affairs so that we'll be able to concentrate on a survivor-centered approach in our work. So one of the things we have done in all the work we do, especially when we come in contact with victims and survivors, is that we look forward, or we take their safety and security into great concern. And how do we do this? If it is a child survivor of sexual violence or a child survivor of domestic violence, the first thing we do is to look for the safety of that child by taking the child, whether it's a boy or a girl, to a safe home. After the child is in the safe home, we now continue to ensure that the case is reported to the police and that the police investigates the case very well, and we follow it for it to be prosecuted and brought to court. Whilst that is going on, we also offer counseling, guidance counseling to the survivor. And at the same time, if it is a case of domestic violence and the community wants to come in to compromise, we don't allow that. We don't even allow negotiations or compromise. Immediately we get the case, we make sure the survivors get justice, because that is what they want. Another thing we always do again is that we secure the consent of the victim and at the same time their privacy. If it is a child victim and we want to document the experience, we'll seek the consent first. And at the same time, when we are documenting, we make sure we don't show the child's face. And again, most of the time in our commission, we work very closely with the complaints directorate, because that directorate is the one that receives most of the complaints in the commission, whether it is complaints from children, whether it's complaints from men, whether it's complaints from boys. But when women and children and even vulnerable groups are taken from them, they bring it to our directorate, and we work very closely with them until that survivor is justified, she seeks justice, or at the end of the day, the survivor will be satisfied with the services we give to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria. I did love the fact that you said no compromise, no mediation. And also thank you for reminding us about the multiple vulnerabilities of survivors that often, are not experiencing just one violation of human rights, but as you just said, like minors experiencing child marriage and also domestic violence. And that when you approach them with a holistic manner, including with ensuring their safety, ensuring their security, and that they do receive support and counseling support. And all of these are also key aspects of the Murad Code. So thank you again for putting this in practice. For the last question in this discussion, I would like to ask Alpha about his experience as a journalist, working with many different media outlets. Alpha, How can journalists help to create conditions to raise awareness and sensitivity about systematic and conflict-related sexual violence issues? And what ethical considerations should journalists keep in mind when they're covering this topic? What initiatives or best practice have been successful in Nigeria's media space in empowering survivors and challenging harmful narrative around sexual violence? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Marion. Creating an environment where survivors of sexual and gender-based violence feel comfortable sharing their stories is key. Some of the strategies I apply are creating a conducive space, that is, establishing a friendly and relaxed atmosphere is essential. Because one needs to be empathetic and ask questions in a sensitive manner. Working with NGOs also very essential. Not necessarily NGOs, it can be a local NGO. Collaborating with these NGOs that support survivors can be highly beneficial. These organizations have established relationships with survivors and can facilitate introduction, ensuring that the journalist approaches in a respectful and supportive manner. We should also be able to explain the impact. It is important to let survivors know that by sharing their stories, they may be able to help amplify the challenges faced by all survivors. We must also know that it is important not to overstate this impact or to pressure anyone into telling their story to serve the goal of amplifying challenges all survivors face. Story I covered with Leo immensely under Boko Haram. Her husband was killed, her baby was thrown, it was a baby girl, was thrown against the wall and she was abducted. She refused forced marriage and a suicide bombing mission, and she was severely burned and hospitalized in Maiduguri. Initially rejected by her family, mediation helped to reunite with their mother and daughter. With her mother and daughter, the NYT article, the woman who outsmarted Boko Haram in the US, a GoFundMe campaign enabled Balaraba to return to school, became a nurse, and supported her daughter's education. She eventually graduated from college and became a community leader. When I met her again years later, she has transformed from a victim to a leader, helping other survivors overcome trauma and stigma. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alpha, again, for highlighting a story of healing and empowerment and ultimate hope. As we were preparing for this webinar, Alpha told us about the story already, and we will share the link to this article in the chat. I love the title of this article. It's about a woman who outsmarted Boko Haram. I felt your intervention was extremely valuable because it described the need for upholding really the human rights of survivors. It's creating the space, making the time, establishing a rapport, and often that goes through going through those who know best, those who are on the front line, as you mentioned, the civil society organization, but also managing expectations, which is extremely important. And above all is respecting the consent of the survivors who, as we know or we should respect, can withdraw from any process at any time, be it an interview for media or the participation in a truce or judicial process. Thank you again to all of you, Councillor George, Fatu, Gloria, and Alpha. You have offered us various insight and have covered many of the principles entailed in the Murad Code, and which, when applied, contribute to the fact that the documentation of systematic and conflict-related sexual violence is ethical and empowering for survivors. Thank you also for reminding us that healing is a journey, and that speaking out alone, even a conviction alone, does not suffice to rebuild dignity. And a lot of responsibility falls on us actors of transitional justice processes, as well as journalists, investigators, CSOs, representatives, to ensure that these conditions are met so that survivors feel empowered. I'd like now to open the floor to questions. We have around 20 minutes, and so we will take a few questions. We will ask some of you to unmute and to share your question with the panelists, and the panelists have 1 to 2 minutes to answer. Which one of you should I give the floor to?
Question here from Lawan, which is around, it's a question for Alpha, and it's around the training that journalists in Northeast Nigeria receive before engaging with survivors of systematic and conflict-related sexual violence. So I will ask you, Lawan, to unmute, and please do come in with your question for Alpha.
Yes, and thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the panelists and everyone for the insights and the information. My question goes on, how well do journalists in Northeast Nigeria receive training to engage with survivors of systematic and conflict-related sexual violence? In essence, does their training cover important components like GBV core concepts, ethics, which Alpha, I believe, has touched on, research methodology? And also an important component is we do understand that when we engage with survivors, re-traumatization is something that comes up over and over again. Do journalists have any mental health and psychosocial skills to provide psychosocial first aid, or perhaps any referral services within the media? I just wanted to know if those services are available to survivors, since journalists are engaging with them. Thank you.
Alpha, would you care to respond? Thank you.
Yes, Lauren, thank you for your incisive question. Yes, to a large extent, I will not be speaking for the locals, but from what I know and what I have seen, there were some collaborations with INGOs and other agencies concerned, in which journalists were trained periodically about all the mentioned programs or mentioned cases of dealing with survivors. And I could recall we attended some of these sessions with most of the local media local.
Thank you very much, Alpha, for getting back on this question on training. The next question is to Fatu Balde. Joanna Rice, could you please unmute yourself?
Wonderful to see you again. I wanted to ask about survivor leadership. So I was listening to you and Mr. Isaac George speak about all of the barriers to justice that survivors are facing. And I was thinking, well, these are not just barriers to justice. These are also barriers to being an effective advocate in your own right, for barriers to survivors having the opportunity for themselves to have leadership roles and decision-making roles. And if we want justice and reparation efforts to really effectively meet survivor needs, then their voices really have to be part of policy circles, advocacy circles, judicial circles. But of course, those barriers are enormous. Intimidation from perpetrators and state agents, survivor shaming, a culture that shames survivors in general, economic and health impacts that make it impossible or difficult to mobilize. I would like to hear from all of your experience. What are your recommendations for building survivor leadership and decision-making opportunities in the design and implementation of justice, truth, and reparation-seeking processes? So how do we build survivor leadership, and how do we make decision-making opportunities for survivors?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Joanna. And it's so nice to connect with you here. To the listeners, I was introduced to transitional justice and gender justice by Joanna. And actually, I would very much like, and I think we're talking about transitional justice in general. And I think we also need to reflect on how in many countries when transitional justice starts, we depend on experts coming from other countries to support national be it civil society organizations, be it these structures that are set up to at the national level. You have mentioned things that usually were occurring before the violation started. So, for example, if you talk about any of the different forms of gender-based violence or sexual and gender-based violence, you would often see that these are issues that were already existing before the violation occurred. So when we try to address these issues, and what you find, for example, in the Gambian context, when we looked at sexual and gender-based violence, it was very much looked at under the context of Jammeh, therefore ignoring the fact that Gambian women were already subjected to all these different discriminations and inequalities before Jammeh, and as we see, that continues today. So for me, it's important when we talk about empowering survivor voices, it also means empowering women-led organizations within these countries, civil society organizations within these countries. And, and this is why I'm so glad that you asked that question, because I believe that that was what Joanna did with me, like empowered me and helped me to build a structure, a civil society organization on the ground, where I learned from her. And years later, as the Truth Commission was going out, a lot of the issues were arising. I could remember some of the things that Joanna said when we were setting up the Truth Commission and most of the experiences I shared. So it's important to build grassroots, to build women-led movement within the country so that when the Truth Commission, for example, ends, there are institutions, when international communities leave and the experts leave, that national, local-led or grassroots organizations can continue the work. Thank you.
Wonderful. I love the fact that feminist organizations are empowered and get their seat at the table and get to discuss important political decisions, and importantly, probably not only related to sexual violence, but also to leadership. And I note that the name of your organization is not only on liberation, but also on leadership. Thank you so much. The next question is from Callan to Councillor George. Callan, could you please unmute yourself?
Thank you so much. I want to say that I really enjoyed the presentations, and this is quite good. And so my question, I have two questions. The one that I put in the chat box, and the question is from the country where I live. In most cases, the survivors are not taken care of as much as the perpetrators in some cases. And what really happens is that once the offense has occurred, you would realize now the society comes up because the perpetrator is from the society, the victim is from the society, they will agitate that the case is dealt with out of court. And once such discussions begin, the case ends up thrown away. So I'm just wondering how the other parts of this world, the other African countries have succeeded in making sure the perpetrators face the law. Then my other question is a challenge that we get in my country, Kenya, is safety of the survivor, because not many areas have achieved safe houses, and therefore I am wondering what can really happen in such a situation, or how did some of you manage to come up with safe houses for the survivors immediately immediately after the offense has occurred, before they are able to think of where to go next for safety, maybe even after counseling and support has been given. Thank you. Back to you.
Okay, so thank you for the question. So basically, what you've explained, we have similar issues in our country. There are commonalities, but over the years, what we've done, we've been able to establish what we call the one-stop center, and we coin it as the referral pathway. And in that case, cases are reported to the hospital first, and thereafter it goes for psychosocial, and then the person is taken to the police. And after the police, they go to the safe home, and from the safe home, they proceed to court. So what we've done is more of education. We've said that over the years, there are more cases reported now than 20 years ago. There are more cases reported now than 10 years ago. It is based on education. The fact that we've had education and awareness programs within communities, within schools, within religious settings. These education and awareness programs have informed and enlightened survivors, victims, that there are forums for redress. And so because they now understand that there are forums for redress, the number of cases being reported are far higher. And there are questions to that effect, that why it is true that there are education and awareness, why are there more cases being reported? And the simple answer is because people now believe that there is a forum for redress. So basically, education, awareness would be a factor to increase the number of cases reported and to give the victim, survivor, that confidence that yes, indeed, there is a forum that can protect them whenever the cases are reported. Then the question you asked, if a perpetrator is in hiding or he hides himself, what happens? Well, under our laws, we have what we call statute of limitation. And it is said that if a case is reported within 5 years, that case can be prosecuted. So once it is not, hello? So once it is not a capital offense, if it's a felony of the first degree, that case should be reported within 5 years. If it is a misdemeanor, it should be reported within 3 years. But if it is a capital offense, then that does not have a statute of limitation. So whether the perpetrator escapes or he's in hiding, once the case is reported, whenever he's found, that case begins. So that's what the law we have. And I think around the world, in Kenya, I don't know, I'm not actually versed with the laws in Kenya, but I believe that these laws they have some commonalities. And I believe that the law in Kenya may extend to that. So the first thing is the case must be reported. I don't care whether the perpetrator has left the country, whether the perpetrator is in hiding, report the case. But education is a hallmark. We must educate our people to believe that there are forums for redress. And as I said, in Liberia, we have the one-stop center, the referral pathway, that cases are reported procedurally. So that is what we follow. And I think Kenya may have similar things. Possibly it has not reached the rural areas yet, but I think that there are forums, and as we educate our people, more cases will be reported, and there will be an increment in terms of the number of persons who will be brought forward to be punished or to be convicted for crimes for perpetrating violence against women and girls. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for another question, and the question is from Vanessa. And Vanessa, thank you. As I've seen the question, how you typed it, and we couldn't hear you very well. I will read the question as you had typed it in the chat for Gloria. So in the chat, you said, how long does the survivor stay in a safe homes? And how do you make sure that survivors are protected after justice is being done? Is that something you could answer from your experience, Gloria?
Yeah, in the first place, we actually don't have a government-owned safe home as I speak. Most of the safe homes are owned by NGOs and international partners. Like we have a safe home owned by the Don Bosco Salesian Fathers. The Don Bosco, they most of the time keep the children until they know the child is safe to be reunited to his or her family. And the other question? That's the first one.
The other question was to explain how you can make sure that the survivor is protected once justice is done, so that there's no retaliation.
Yeah, like we work very closely with the Don Bosco family, and most of the time we are very satisfied with their services, because they have psychosocial counselors and social workers that stay with these children, and they even accompany the children to court when it comes to court. They will accompany them also to the Rainbow Initiative. Rainbow Initiative is like a one-stop center that George was talking about. It is a one-stop center, and as soon as the child or the victim is sent there, they make sure they take care of the child holistically and not just halfway. So, but most often they give medical assistance to the Don Bosco family, the clients of the Don Bosco family. So the social workers will accompany that child if it has anything to do with medical. They will accompany the child if it has anything to do with the police or to court. Then at the end of the day, when they are satisfied that the case is now handled and they want to reunite the children, they make sure the environment is safe for that child. We have a lot of cases where at the end of the day, the children are not able to be reunited up till now. And they have very comfortable places where they stay. They even give them psychosocial training and also skills training. They'll give them a lot of skills, and some of them are sent to schools nearby the community so that they will not lose out. That is what we do here in Sierra Leone.
Thank you very much, Gloria. I can see we have still other questions in the chat, but as we're coming to a close, I'm very sorry. I think it's we need to stop now. And here I'd like to thank all of you for your participation and attention. The number of participants raised to almost 80 as we were ongoing. And I would also like to thank the interpreters for their work. Clearly, one of them has worked more than the other. Merci beaucoup. And maybe as last words, we wanted to say that just as the healing we have talked about today, applying a survivor-centered approach is a journey. But I'm confident that today we did a big step in the right direction. and hope that all of us will leave this space with a renewed commitment to put survivors, which include women and girls and men and boys, as many of you have reminded us, at the center of any transitional justice process. And that we never overlook the gender impact of many dynamics. It is up to all of us to apply and translate these words into action. And the Murad Code is one tool to do that. It helps rethinking systems and processes. It also reminds us that we need to apply an individualized approach to survivors based on an individualized assessment of their needs and of their risks. As highlighted today at several occasions, informed consent is key. And last but not least, the code emphasizes that survivors need support channels, such as social support. I want to apologize to those participants who had questions and that we couldn't answer. You could put them to us in the chat, and we could channel them to our participant and maybe get back to you at a later stage. My colleague has put the website of the Murad Code project in the chat in case you would like to learn more about it or download the Murad Code versions, which are available in 11 languages. It was a true pleasure. It has been a true pleasure, to be your host today, and I wish you a very good rest of the week. Thank you very much on behalf of the International Institute for Criminal Investigations.